In this episode of The Spirit Side, we are going to be talking about life and religion without God. What happens when we become our own God? And what happens when we construct a religion or a philosophy that does not have a divine being that we look to and gain inspiration from? Very interesting topic coming up next. Stay tuned. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to The Spirit Side. I'm your host, Paul James Caden, and today on the show we are going to be talking about life and religion without God. And I hope my microphone isn't picking up the hum of the air conditioning unit during this show. It's the summer months, getting into the summer months, and it's pretty hot out there right now. And sometimes when I record, when the AC is going, we get a little bit of a hum or a drone in the background. But as I always say, such are the pitfalls of podcasting, and I hope if my very sensitive mic picks up that noise, it's not disturbing to the listening audience. But nonetheless, ladies and gentlemen, we wanted to talk today about life and religion without God. This is a pretty interesting topic, I think, that needs to be talked about because, there's a lot of people in the world who say you don't need God to be a good person. You don't need God to be moral. And we also have religions and philosophies in the world. Some of them are quite popular that believe this idea of, as they call the invisible God or a personal God, is just, it's outlandish. There might be a universal intelligence, but as L. Ron Hubbard would say in Scientology, when it comes to fixing problems in your life, you're the only God who is going to be on the scene. So who are you praying to? Now, did I just take a dig at Scientology? Well, no, and I'm going to explain that in just a moment when we get into the religions and philosophies that dismiss a personal God. And some of them, in fact, most of them, including Scientology, if you read, being one who's studied a lot of different religions and just wants to know what makes them tick, if you read the early literature in Scientology, it's not really that bad when it's talking about how to bring more peace into your life, how to master these emotions of, fear and stress and anger. But unfortunately, as the religion went on and L. Ron Hubbard wrote more and more books to add on to it, it became more and more bizarre. We'll just leave it, leave it at that. But, Buddhism isn't a religion that has God. And it's, a pretty wonderful religion and philosophy. But what happens when we take God out of the equation and say, I'm the only God who's on the scene. I'm responsible for myself, not anybody else. There's nobody there looking out for me. There's no higher being that I look to be moral or good. Well, let's start at the beginning and talk about life without God. Now, I have known people in my life who are more or less atheistic, and they're good people. Some of them, some of the best people that I've ever known. But I notice in the lives even of, the best people that I've known, there's a tendency, and this goes across the board. Any person who says, well, I don't believe in God, I don't believe in anything, or I'm agnostic, I don't really know, I just look after myself, my own common sense, my own intuition, my own decisions, my own free will. There's a tendency in that kind of life to become the center of our own universe. I mean, in a very chronic sort of way. And I notice a lot of these people, they're very easily upset. Many of them get very defensive. And a lot of times over nothing at all. It's just one little thing that will push them in the wrong direction, and a very bad argument can ensue. Insults thrown, hurtful words to family members and friends. Because when we become the center of our own universe, it's almost like we're an island unto ourselves. Yes, there's other people around me. Yes, there's a world I have to deal with. Yes, there are people that are important to me. But also, here I am on my little island. My thoughts, my beliefs, my feelings, my desires. And if you don't agree with that, or I think somehow you're putting that down, I'm going to attack you. And we see a lot of people, especially in the world right now, following that pattern. I was watching YouTube the other day, and there was a young man, maybe in his mid-latter 20s, maybe approaching, 30, early 30s. But he was really kind of bashing on religion. And it was humorous. It was funny, and some of the things he said were absolutely true. But he made this statement, and he said, all of this religion, all of this stuff about God, it's utterly ridiculous to those of us who are smarter. And he made the statement that, and most of us who are generally smarter than are the people who are younger. We're smarter than the older generation. We're not as superstitious or given into these ideas of God and angels and, invisible beings. And I found that to be an interesting statement because, granted, a lot of the younger people are smarter than the older generation because they're digging into subjects and learning things that the older generation looked at as taboo, or it just didn't matter, to study philosophy, to know certain things about history, to know certain things about the way the universe works, to know certain things about how some things in a lot of our religions are a lot of nonsense invented by men and institutions. Older people didn't want to know this. And that was a detriment to the older people's intelligence, to their education, and to them to actually be able to make a reasonable scientific stand on the issue of faith. And I remember when I was younger and I really ventured off and started looking for reasons. Why do I believe what I believe? Here I am, I was, eyeball deep in the evangelical, fundamentalist, Christian religion at that time. And I said, I want to know why. I just take it by faith, because the preacher told me or my parents told me. And I started really doing comparative religion, reading different books and looking science and religion and history and religion. And it took me in many different avenues of study. And my parents and especially my father, and other relatives and older people would say, well, I don't know why you want to do that for. And some of them would say, boy, you study that stuff too much and look into too much of that stuff, it'll drive you crazy. You'll start to lose your marbles after a while. So they really had some odd ideas, about breaking out of that bubble. So I understand that. And, I'm an older person. I'm 54, but I saw when I was in my late teens and into my early 20s, I started to study. I started to explore. I started to look for answers. I wasn't satisfied with just saying, this is what I believe and I'll always believe it just because. And boy, I'll tell you, I'm so glad that I did that. But the issue being, when you look at this younger person and say, well, we're the smarter generation, are they really? I mean, they're smarter in the fact that they look into more avenues of study and research, and they know things that their parents didn't know or didn't dare to even think about wanting to know. But then look at the conundrum that the younger generation has themselves in. They claim to be smarter, yet there are certain things you can't talk about because they're trigger words. These younger people start to like flip out and cry, and they need a safe place. They need to go in, a room, college aged, people, young men and women, need to go in a safe room that are in colleges now, college campuses, young adults, and pet puppies or hold a bunny, because a trigger word was said. We have this whole cancel culture, where they take their own ideas and just run with it without fully knowing all the facts. So, if we're going to sit there and throw around this idea about who's the smarter generation, well, it's a lose-lose argument, because we're always going to have a generation that is more ignorant when it comes to their education. But then we're always going to have the younger generation who may be more educated, but so very ignorant when it comes to just common sense, how to deal with life and what our parents called the real world. So name your poison. So it doesn't matter how smart we are, how educated we think we are. Here we have classic example in a lot of the younger generation, not all, but, some, of life without God. We have trigger words. We have depression is greater, than it was when I was growing up. Many more school-age children, young people in their, teens and 20s committing suicide because they say they feel empty, they feel lost, they feel that they don't fit in, they feel that nobody likes them, they have all of these mental, emotional, and psychological issues that drive many to take their own lives, and many others to have to go pet, a furry animal if a certain word is said or a certain time of history is mentioned. I mean, how abnormal and unhealthy is that? And that's not picking on anybody. That's just life without God. It's just a classic example of becoming the center of our own universe. And what's going to make that universe collapse? There's nothing greater than ourselves that we draw morality and strength and wisdom from. And I don't mean morality, strength, and wisdom in the old condemning, hellfire, brimstone, fear preaching from the pulpits, religious kind of way. Because that particular subject is a podcast all unto itself. And it's something I might talk about in the next episode. Religion, with having a God who is more in our image, the image of a man. That some people's, apparently a lot of people throughout history, can't get past God being this transcendental being that far surpasses what we are as human beings. So we make him like us. And what we hate, he hates. The people he thinks should be killed, well, we think should be killed. It becomes a real perversion of true religion and spirituality. And it's not that far from the native primitive religions of the past. Where once man worshipped the elements, the lightning, the mountains, the trees, the wind, the rain, all these things were gods. And then eventually God became a more personal being, but he became like the big chieftain in the sky. He was, just as barbaric as, they were. And that's really carried over in a lot of our religions, following a God who is made in our image as human beings. And so that's not the kind of morality I'm talking about at all. That kind of thing is definitely wrong. And it's something we need to get past. It's something a lot of people can't get past in this world. A lot of people can't get past it in religion. And it's understandable that there's so many young people and even older people that were once upon a time religious, just jumping ships on the churches and the religions, and they don't want any part of it anymore because it's not fulfilling them anymore. It's become a stagnant thing unto itself, just filled with fear and condemnation and thou shalt not and rules and regulations and people wearing plastic smiles and the plastic congregation with the plastic pastor. And it's just become a surreal mess. It's the best word I can think of right now. So, I'm in agreement with the younger generation on a lot of that. It's not that religion is bad and we have to throw it away, but the old interpretations of religion, which were incorrect anyway. And that information was there all along of how it was incorrect, why it was incorrect, why the Bible was misinterpreted, why certain words were mistranslated, and all that information is there, but that was the corner the older generation painted themselves in because they were afraid to study and research, because it was considered in their day too something that was bad, something that was evil. You'll drive yourself nuts, you'll lose your faith, God won't be pleased. And so they got painted into a corner, and religion has become a real mess in its own right. So drawing strength from God, spirituality, religion, and sometimes I use the word religion with a little bit of caution because it generally brings about notions of that kind of religion that none of us are really pleased with. And there's certainly not a whole lot of strength there to draw from, for anybody. it just gets you into condemnation, more questions, more fear. It's not a good place to be. So that's not where we want to be, and that's not what I'm talking about when I talk about drawing morality, peace, strength, inspiration from spirituality and religion. I'm not referring to any of that kind of stuff at all. But now, let's talk about religion without God. And there are philosophies and religions and cults that more or less don't believe in what they call the invisible God, or they believe that they're God, or there might be an intelligence to the universe, but it's beyond our understanding. So they fashion their religion after more psychological, psychiatric, scientific kind of doctrines and dogmas and patterns of belief. And I mentioned in the beginning, Buddhism and Scientology. Buddhism does a pretty good job when it comes to teaching a way where people are more stable in their emotions. Even being a student of the Urantia book says that Buddhism as a philosophy, as a religion without God is really a rarity in the world because of what it teaches and what the outcome of those teachings are. But then we have other religions, and I mentioned, Scientology just being one of them, that might not necessarily have bad ideas, and some of it is a little reflective of Buddhism in a way. L. Ron Hubbard himself said that the religion or the philosophy that Scientology is closest to would be Buddhism. But yet it goes astray. There's some component there missing, as there are, and I'm not just targeting Scientology. I mean, there are other groups as well that try to be kind of Buddhistic, if you will, in their approach to philosophy and religion without God. And most, if not all of them, aside from Buddhism, religion without God seems to spiral in the same direction as life without God. It becomes fanatical. It becomes defensive. It becomes argumentative. It starts to get very strange in many of its approaches and doctrines because the person or the people in charge of that religion or that philosophy generally look at themselves as being, the God, the God presence. Not that they would think that they're God, but they're the enlightened head of the religion or the philosophy, or they're the founder, so they know all this great, cosmic or, mental, metaphysical type wisdom. And so again, they become an island unto themselves, and they start, even if it starts out good like Scientology did, with some very good ideas, it eventually begins to spiral as the teachings and the doctrines and the philosophy gets stranger and stranger and more bizarre. And before you know it, we have something that nobody even sees the good parts of it anymore because it's so overshadowed with the craziness and the fanaticism and the even the ego and the arrogance of a lot of those groups who look down on other people like, oh, look at those, poor, uneducated, foolish people that believe in the invisible God, and, granddaddy in the sky or whatever it is, they call the divine being. And so, it spirals. And we look at all this, and I made mention that religion of old, the way the older generation perceived it and taught it and followed it, that wasn't really any good either. And it certainly, spiraled. I mean, it hated, it killed, it persecuted, different people that, they were prejudiced against or that they thought were heathens. So where is the middle ground in all of this? Where do we find the real inspiration and peace of God in our lives? How do we get over this problem of life and religion without God, and also the problem of religion with a God who's made in our man-made, hateful, judging, murderous, greedy, arrogant image? How do we get by all of that? Because these three types of life and religion without God, or even with God, that we're talking about in this podcast, all three of them fall into the same rut. They all become self-centered. They all become judgmental. They all become the center of their own universe. Even the people with the God in their own image. God is a man, as I always like to call the God who is a man of war. They all fall into the same pit. They become the center of their own universe. Everyone else is stupid. They implode when their ideology is attacked. They fall to pieces emotionally, becoming very angry, fits of rage, violence, or just crumbling and crying and saying that they're being persecuted, that they're being hurt. They all have their prejudices. They all have their violence. I mean, you have some of the younger generation who say, religion, we need to get rid of it all. It's done nothing but have trouble. And, look at all the people that, the religions of the world have killed. And they're right. But then they'll turn around and say religion should be outlawed and all the people who follow it should be, jailed, executed, imprisoned, hung, put before firing squads. So again, right into the same ditch as the other two out of the three. And this becomes a real problem. Now, we are all finite and fallible human beings, but there has to be a place where we at least get on some kind of more even and solid ground and begin to grow from there. But how? And I hate to leave a little bit of a cliffhanger, but I think that's something we are going to talk about in the next podcast, or possibly on Friday. I might expand a little bit more on this God in our own image concept on Wednesday's show. We'll see where the spirit moves me. I generally do these shows by what I feel inspired to do. What comes to me like, hey, you got to talk about this in this particular show. And then I hook up the mic and do my best and blather through it, but Some of you are kind enough to listen anyway. But yeah, I think that's something we're gonna tackle a little bit later this week, because there needs to be some changes in the way that we're doing things. Because the three that we just talked about, life without God, religion without God, and religion with a God made in our own man-made image, all three are failures. They all fall into the same pit, the same problems, the same attitudes, the same heinous ways of wanting to address life's problems or people they don't like. And that needs to be changed. Because there's a lot of people out there that have walked away from God, a lot of people that will never find God because of the despicable attitudes and treatment of people that say that they are religious and the old ways of religion. It becomes a vicious cycle. So I think this is going to be a week where we talk about some of these things and maybe reach a little bit of a conclusion to take some steps in the right direction in our personal lives. So I thank everyone for listening. I always appreciate it that you tuned in. I hope you got something out of this podcast today. And until next time, stay safe, stay well, stay in the light. And I will talk to you next time here on the Spirit Side.